Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the BSR. My name is Marta Pillerini, and I am Visual Art Residency and Program Curator at the BSR. Thank you for being with us tonight for our second Fine Arts Talk of 2024, which will be given by sculpture installation artist Permindar Kaur. First of all, I would like to thank Permindar for accepting our invitation. I came across her work through BSR alumna Barbara Walker, and I was immediately fascinated by her playful approach to art that uses childlike objects to explore the territory of cultural identity, home and belonging. Kaur will introduce her creative practice from 1990 to the current day, starting from her large-scale projects in the UK, which led to international exhibitions in New York, Australia, Japan, Portugal, and Norway. Kaur will also explore how her practice and career changed and developed after she started her family, and we'll talk about her current research and plans for a solo show that will take place at John Hansard Gallery this summer. Tonight, will offer us a chance to know more about the artist's work and practice, but also it will be an opportunity to ask any questions we might have for her in the Q&A session. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Permindar Kaur.
Thank you so much. I normally start my talks explaining where I studied. So I was born in Nottingham, which is in the centre of the UK, in the Midlands, in the 60s. Then I went to study fine art at Sheffield Polytechnic, where I did a generalist fine art course. After that, I moved to Glasgow School of Art, where I did a master's in fine art. So the first work I'm going to show you is a self-portrait I made, which was made in between when I was living in Sheffield, because I got a studio, and before I moved to Glasgow. There's me in this industrial studio, because Sheffield used to be the heart of the steel industry. So there was lots of big empty warehouses, which a lot of artists had studios in. I saw a show that was advertised by Eddie Chambers asking for Afro-Caribbean and Asian artists who had a work that was a self-portrait. So I decided to make this very large self-portrait of myself. It's over 2 meters high, and it took quite many months making, because I sort of painstakingly welded each separate rod to make this structure. It was very much based on the work I was doing as a student. And yeah, so at that time I was working on the idea of making things large, but also invisible. And I had defined my language when I was a student. So I knew that I wanted to I played with scale, making things bigger, smaller. I also was limiting myself to working with 2 materials, and I didn't want to use real objects. And I worked mainly in sculpture. So this was shown in Eddie Chambers' show called Let the Canvas Come to Life with Dark Faces. And looking back at this work of that time, I realized it's hard to see that this work was made by an Asian person or an Indian person. It's not so obvious. And that was something that interested me. It wasn't intentional. For me, this is quite an accurate self-portrait of myself. I filled the head with lots of wooden objects that I made. And all of these objects were a mixture of Indian objects and Western objects. And so it's only filled to a certain level because it was about the memories I had growing up in the UK and having an Indian heritage. So you couldn't really see what the objects are, all of them, but they're also like giant toys. So for me, they're like memories of who I was. And then there's room for lots more memories, to fill the rest of the head up. But the most interesting thing, I think, is the fact that it's so big, but then you can see all the way through it. So it's monumental, but invisible at the same time. It's been a while since I've done a Zoom talk. And so sort of getting used to talking at the computer again. After Sheffield, I moved to Glasgow School of Art. I moved to Glasgow, where I studied on a 2-year MA. And the first work I liked that I made there was called This, Arrival. A lot of my earlier work is about my Indian background, my heritage, as you'll see the first few works. When my parents moved to the UK, they lived in Glasgow before moving to Nottingham. So this work was sort of about them, thinking this is where they arrived. And yeah, and marked their space. So I decided to make these double-sided arrows. So like marking their territory that they're here. And then on top of these arrows, I placed all these glass objects. So they were, again, like memories. So they're bringing, and all the objects are Indian. So you've got like a small house, like a 1-story house found in the Punjab, some white trousers, a cart. So they're all Indian, but they're also, some of them you might know what they are, some you wouldn't know, but they are made out of glass. So as carrying on this idea of things being visible and present. So they were about the memories, but because there's this fragility and precariousness. Because the arrows only, speared into the ground. It's basically you just spear it into the ground. So as you walk around them, they do waver, and it does move. And you're thinking if you did knock into one, it quite easily could be shattered. And there's another detail. Whenever you photograph glass, the colors always change. In the first year of my MA, I was invited by Eddie Chambers to make a work for a show called 4x4. So this is me in my studio in Glasgow. And I decided to expand on these glass houses to make larger glass houses. And so now, instead of there being an individual glass houses, it was more about the community. Because when I lived in Glasgow, I was there going to the art school, living with other students. And then on the other side, there was my extended family who I would visit. And they were extremely religious, so that was quite new to me. And going from one house to another in the night to do prayer, because they had prayer rooms in their house. So this work is more about the community, the hidden community that existed in Glasgow. Oh, that's the catalogue and all the artists that took part in the show. I showed work in the Arnolfini in Bristol. And there's the work I made for that. This image is actually from the fruit market in Edinburgh. The original work, I had 6 glass houses. They are about 180 centimeters tall, so slightly taller than me. And they are made in the design of houses found in the Punjab in the north of India, where my family come from. Single stories, often with stairs on the outside, and flat roofs. Inside them, I placed ceramic objects. All these ceramic objects were Indian objects that you would find in the villages where my family come from. But because I've made them, there's another image. There's some of the ceramic objects. Because I'd made them all out of ceramics, you weren't sure if they were historical or everyday or of their identity. And I also placed them often in stacks. So, because I realized when I was putting them in these spaces, they looked like a museum show because of all the glass. So it has these sort of connotations, like it could be a museum display of historical objects, or is it a display of everyday items? As you can see in this photo, there's glass on the floor. They have doors as well. So originally I wanted people to walk into the houses as well, you know, so you could get close to the ceramic objects. So there's lots of different meanings behind this work, and it can be read in lots and lots of different ways, because the houses are made out of glass. There's a saying, people should not throw glass. No, I can't remember it now. Do not. Anyway, I should. It's a saying I forgot. If I remember it, I'll say it later. About people throwing stones living in glass houses. Yeah, so that work was made when I was in my first year at Glasgow. And the context again was, I think Eddie Chambers was trying to move on the conversation about the work that's made by Black and Asian artists to be more about installations, or it could be about lots of other areas. So some of them like this are quite religious symbols from, because my family, we're Sikhs, so it's a, you know, I don't know if many people know about the Sikh religion, but these are quite images or symbols from the Sikh religion. In my second year at Glasgow, I was I put a proposal in. Again, we were invited as students to put a proposal in for this project that was created by the BBC. The BBC made a documentary about art on billboards. And so they had quite a lot of, you know, good name artists in there. They had Damien Hirst, Howard Hodgkins. It was about 18 artists taking over 200 billboards across the whole of the UK. I decided to make a billboard that was very site-specific in Glasgow and a sculptural billboard. Yeah, so that's, so my proposal was successful. So as you can see, so I got to make this work. And I decided at that time I'd been started to work with copper, and I was exploring different ways of, so each place I go to, I try and change, you know, develop different materials I can work with and the ideas associated with that. And for me, copper is a material that I've stayed working with for quite a long time now. So this was made in '92 in May. And as you can see, maybe the post at the back, Labour Day, there was a general election going on. So billboards back then were quite an important way of advertising, of, you know, it was that the billboards were, you know, they had quite a lot of presence and they were quite important. And so I decided to do a message that was a bit more like a private conversation, but in a public space. So first of all, I had to find 2 billboards that faced each other across the street. Not as easy as you would think. And this was right in the centre of Glasgow. So the art school was just up the road and the train station is just around the corner. And so there's the 2 billboards. I was quite happy they let me cut holes in the billboard, because I wanted the idea that this voice was coming from behind the billboard. So on one billboard, there's like one giant copper speaker. and on the other are 3 smaller ones. On the big one, I've used an 8-sided star pattern, which is found on lots of buildings in northern India. And on the other, the symbols are a lotus flower, a wheel, and my initials PK. And this was to do with the fact that when there was an election going on, I mean, this is from back then, I'm thinking about like early 90s, when I was in India, when there's an election going on, a lot of the time, because the levels of literacy are, you know, they're not 100%. So the different political parties would have a symbol to represent their parties. So here I've given each speaker a different symbol. But like I said, this was more like a work about a private conversation. It's not like going on in a public space. So you have the large speaker talking to the 3 smaller speakers across the street. After Glasgow, I'd applied to go to the Rijks Academy in Amsterdam, and I'd been accepted, and I was going to go, been offered as an amazing stipend. But I also, meanwhile, had 6 months, you know, I'd just left college out in the big wild world. I didn't know what I was going to do. And some friends had moved to Barcelona. So I joined them. And then I decided to stay in Barcelona, where I lived on and off for about 6, 7 years during the 90s. And whilst I was there, I showed in different exhibitions at that time. And my work, whilst I was there, changed quite drastically, because I had started out making work in the context of being a British Asian artist. And then when I lived in Barcelona, I was an artist, and I didn't have that context. So I had to rethink what I wanted to make work about, that basically. And also being there, learning Spanish, learning the way of life there, the systems there, and being around other Catalan artists, it did affect the work I made. So my first show there was in 94, I think, at La Capella, which was an old church. It was a 2-person show with Calma Samel. So yeah, so it was a beautiful space. And so I couldn't resist, like in the images on the right, to make a work about Sikhism. I had to do, so here in this work, I'd place a marble floor, because in Gurdwaras, the Sikh temple, often they are white marbled floors. And then I'd place this yellow cushion there with a little Sikh insignia in the corner. It was too much of a temptation. It was a church, so I was going to do something about Sikh religion there. And then other works were all to do about the home and the domestic, because I think being there a lot, I went a lot into my head a lot whilst I was living there. Yeah, so this work in the front was 7 houses hanging on chains with 2 copper houses and then 5 steel houses, and very much, you know, English style houses. So a lot of the work I made in Barcelona then went to get shown in this show, the British Art Show, which is a very important show in the UK. It happens every 5 years. It's meant to be the most interesting arts happening at that time. So I was invited to be in that show in 95, and they showed 5 works of mine, all different works I'd made whilst I was living in Barcelona. So I'll talk a bit about those works now. Even though I said that Barcelona changed my work, and the first work I made is very much a Sikh garment. And this was shown in La Capella as well. It's quite small. It's 60 by 72 centimeters. It's a small child's dress. And when I first showed it in Barcelona, I think it's read as a Middle Eastern garment. People thought it was a real garment that, you know, the child would wear, which, I mean, I sort of understood, you know, because there wasn't a large Sikh community in Barcelona, so why should anyone know about it, really? And people assume the knife was real, but it's not. It's something I made out of iron, and the dress I made. So for me, the most important thing about this work was not that it was a Sikh garment. I mean, it was a Sikh garment in the fact that the color orange is a very important color for Sikhs. And the Sikhs carry 5Ks with them as symbols of their religion. One of them is a knife, the kapan. The other is a comb, underpants, a bangle, and long hair. They're the 5Ks that Sikhs have. And often they have these things to represent their belief in or how religious they are. So that's why it's a Sikh garment. But for me, the most important aspect was, why would a child be needing to carry a knife or wear a knife? So it's more, for me, it's about being born into religion, about choice, then, yes. The fact that no garment, no culture would have a garment where a child has a knife. Another work that was in the British Art Show was this work, Cot. Because I make a lot of the work myself, it gives me a lot of freedom to change and alter shapes and styles. So here, the cot sort of looks like it's growing upwards and outwards. And it's reminiscent of The Princess and the Pea, because there are 7 mattresses. So it's like the story, whoever sleeps in this cot, will they be able to feel the pea underneath? Or in this case, the layers of the different garments, which are squashed in. And then there's also feels a bit precarious because they're balanced on very little wheels that don't seem to be able to support the whole structure. I made the frame in white, so there's the idea that of innocence, but red also, so it's a bit homely as well. And this was another work in the Capella show and also the British Art Show. It's called Two Dreams. I realized a lot with my work that when you take photos of it, it's very difficult to judge scale. This is a life-size single bed. It's in the style of beds found in India. They're just very basic, no headboards. And I've placed these dresses at the edge, one in white and one in red. So it was about choice, and it's and the dresses have become like the pillows. So it's like, which one, sleep on this bed, which choice does the person make? Another work in the British Art Show were these sleeping figures. On the left image, it's of them in my studio, which doesn't look so friendly and welcoming. But for me, I love studios that are all concrete. You know, I like sturdy places to have my studio. And then the right is in an exhibition. And often in my work, I used to use like, I always thought there was a harsh element, the metal, and then you had the fabric, which softened the message and softened the work. But here it's all fabric. And I think the message here can also be harsh, even though all the work's all made out of all fabric. So there are 4 blob-like figures, 1 dark blue, 3 yellow. And I was surprised when I showed it because I thought it's quite a throwaway work. I don't know if it's a real work or, you know, it's quite playful as well. But people felt quite upset about these poor figures sleeping in the corner of the gallery, which surprised me because the figures have no features. They're just 2 blobs. They're like 2 circles, a head, you know, a circle for the head and a circle for the body. They're very, very basic. But I was surprised at the feelings they invoked about people want to know who the figures were and what they symbolized. When I first made it, I thought it was quite a playful work, you know, about these figures sleeping in the corner of the gallery. And so there's that duality in my work about the playful and the disturbing side, which sort of goes throughout all my work. And so the next show I'm going to talk about is Cold Comfort. This was a show at the Icon Gallery in Birmingham in '96. And there's the work I made for it. Here, I'm not showing you all the work I made because it's quite a lot. So I was making lots and lots of beds at this time. So here the beds now are over 3 meters high. On one level, they seem quite inviting because of colourful mattresses. But of course, it's not a safe place to sleep. I've climbed on those ladders and I've laid on the beds, and I actually quite like it up there because on one level you've got your own space where no one can disturb you. You're on your own, high up, you have your own space, and there's some sense of security in that. But on another level, would you feel that you could sleep in them? Would you trust your body not to roll out? It's like the work was sort of about, do you trust your body to sort of look after yourself in some ways? The whole show now, when I'm looking back at it, I realize the whole show is about falling. Everything in the show, the work, everything's falling. The work on the back wall, there they are, it's called Falling. And I made these fabric figures which are curled up into impossible positions. And to me, they looked like they were falling down the wall. So that's why it's called Falling. Some of them are unraveling, some are opening up, but the majority are just curled up into these tight ball-like, just curled up. So this became like the wallpaper to this room. So it became like this bedroom, a large domestic space. And it's not about the individual bedrooms because there are 3 beds. And it's not about relationships. Then I would have made 2 beds. It's more about, I suppose, 3 people. And then on the outside wall, and one of the works was this, which is, it was a curtain, which you can't see here. There was a glass plane there in that frame. So in this work, the curtains fall into the floor, so that they're like green birds, which would be able to be snap fastened onto the curtain, the white curtain, but the glass pane is in the way. So the patterns fallen off the curtain as well. So everything's just falling. And here, I suppose the birds can't go back up onto the curtain. And the next work I'm going to, this is check time, yeah. The next work I'm going to talk about is a show I was invited called Independent Practices. It was a show that was in lots of different galleries, and it was all about to celebrate 50 years of India's independence. And it was in lots of northern galleries across the UK, because India gained independence in 1947. And so I was asked to make a work about this, which was quite difficult because I always thought my work was quite playful. It's not that political at all. And to try and find a way into making a work of a theme that is quite heavy, because the border that was made in 1947 to create Pakistan, that border happened overnight. The decision where the border was going. My family come from the Punjab, and that was an area that was cut in two to make Pakistan. So there was a huge movement of people at that time. My parents were quite young, so I was asking them about it. Over 15 million people moved and over 1 million people died at that time. Because if you were a Sikh or a Hindu and you were suddenly found yourself on the Pakistan side of the border, you had to move over to India. And if you were Muslim, you had to move over to Pakistan. So it was quite a brutal event. So then I was thinking about those sort of things. And then I was also thinking about, at that time, the Sikhs also wanted an independent state, Khalistan, which they didn't get. I'm not going to say what I think about that. But so I was also thinking about Sikh independence. And then I was also thinking about independence on a broader, more personal level. So I was thinking all about these different things and to decide what sort of work I would make. So this was the work I made, independence, all that heavy duty, background knowledge of what actually happened at that time and how to respond to that is quite hard. So I made this army of figures. I used the color orange, of course, because they're Sikh. And I'd given them these little copper helmets and copper boots. But because the figures are unstuffed, they can't carry the weight of the armor. The armor does nothing. They can't really use the armor that they're wearing. And further to their plight, I then speared them against the wall with these copper spears. So for me, I was looking at the idea of martyrs. So that the idea, martyrs, because of different, so I remember going to India in about 87 and going to this museum in Amritsar. I don't want to go into too much political, because anyway, there was a museum and there were so many images of people who had died in 1984, and there was all these bloodied images. So I started thinking about martyrs, and so it's sort of playful because they're like toys, but they're also, it's about a defeated army. So when I was, in the UK, often I get invited to do different shows. I'm showing you in particular different shows which have an Asian context. I was invited to do a work about Krishna, the divine lover, as well, which was quite difficult, and it was shown at the Whitechapel Gallery in London. So to make a work, contemporary artwork in context next to all these beautiful, amazing miniatures, contemporary art, it struggles a bit. So the work I made, I decided to do a work about relationships. So this is the work I made. 52 pairs of figures, all in different positions. Some are happy, seem to be like dancing and singing together. Others are a bit more darker. You're not sure what's going on. The figures are, there's no, they're just very basic generic figures. So there's no male or female figure. It's just more about the relationship between two figures. And it's sort of like, I didn't want one to look like this is what the male's doing to the female or vice versa. It was just more generic. And I made 52 pairs, so like one for every day of the week. So it was quite a light, playful work. Because I think the theme as well, the divine lover, is quite, playful. And I used this idea of the pairing of the figures for this next project, which was I was invited to design a product that would be sold in home-based stores. Home-based stores they sell everything to do with the home, and they're stores across the UK. And so then it's trying to think in a different way how to adapt my work to something that's more of a designed product. And I decided to make a shower curtain using these pairings of figures. But here I limited them down to 7 pairs, like one for every day of the week. And it's a shower curtain. I suppose people don't really have shower curtains nowadays, but and then there was an exhibition. So it was quite early on where they were trying to think about how it's quite common now for artists to make products that are sold, or design items that are sold on a larger scale. So, but back then this was quite an interesting project to take part in. I then took a long break for making art, 10 years actually. And I came back to, and this is from like 2000 to 2010. And so the first work I made when I came back was these are quite small figures. So I went back to my fabric figures I made, and now my forms became more animal-like. So there's more like about the animal-human hybrids. And so instead of having armor to protect them, they now have sharp claws, antlers, horns. So yeah, and this work reminds me of the book, Maurice Sendak book. God, what's it called? Anyway, I've forgotten. I should have written this down. So it reminds me of this book that I read, Where the Wild Things Are, that's it, which I read as a child. So here my forms are more, yeah, animal-like. So they don't feel as vulnerable as the figures in Independence, because here their heads up high and they seem more in control, even though they're still unstuffed. And this was a couple of other quite small works, because when I went back to the studio, I wanted to have time just to play, work small scale, and find a new path, and not worry about having an exhibition, or I just wanted to work out what I wanted to make work about. And I also was thinking that maybe my work might have changed drastically, you know, after a 10-year gap, would my work have changed a lot? But the surprising thing for me was that it didn't change that much. When I made this work, I sort of came up with this idea, and then I had looked through all my sketchbooks, and then there was 2 other works I thought I could make from the past, which is strange to make a work from the past, because I'm not like sort of going through those sort of feelings I was in the past. But after making this work and one other, there was lots of different ideas coming. So one idea led to another, and the figures now became more solid. They became stuffed, which was a change. And also they became like animals as well. Here they're teddy bears. And then they started to move towards the idea of camouflage as well, how to hide and disappear in the background. So these figures, they're quite big, but they're sort of been squashed into each canvas. So even though they could be like different types of creatures or monsters, they also seem quite sad that they are locked into this narrow space. They might have their antlers, they might have their horns, and they might have their claws, but they are maybe it's hanging there waiting. They're like garments waiting to be used, waiting to be worn. And there's another couple of those camouflage. So working flat on the wall was a new thing for me. I struggle working flat. I've never liked working flat, but this is as close as I get. So there's a playfulness still in the work and a sadness. And then the work on the right, the nighttime, here the camouflage is copper bumps. And so for me, I like this work because it's like you don't know, did the figure come first? So like, did the figure arrive here and there was no bumps? Or did the figure arrive with the bumps and then the whole environment had bumps? Or did the figure arrive with no bumps, but because he went to an area with lots of bumps, that he then get covered in bumps? And I called it nighttime because for me it's like stars. They look like stars, and it's a dark figure in the nighttime, so it's sort of like hidden. And this was another sort of series of camouflage works. India because I'm Indian, the Spanish because I lived in Spain. In Sweden, I also lived in Sweden for a bit as well. So they're all about different countries. And I was sort of interested in how the claws are more visible in different types of fabrics, and how some fabrics the figure can blend in a lot better than in another fabrics. And it was also quite hard to choose fabrics to represent cultures, because the Indian one was quite obvious, you know, gold and glitzy. The Spanish fabric was some fabric I brought in Spain that I really, really liked. And the Swedish fabric seemed quite typical Swedish there, quite sort of pretty and trim. So, but then I didn't choose a fabric for the UK because I just found that too hard to choose a fabric for here. Because I think here, it's just like so much, it's been so many different cultures influencing the UK that it's just hard to pick a fabric that sort of symbolises the UK, except for the Union Jack, which I was not going to do. And here's another camouflage work. Here, it's like the figure's hidden and you just see the figure's antlers. And then the figures, I started to use Indian fabric. I mean, this was unusual for me because I used Indian fabric, which I thought was quite gold and glitzy, and I'm using copper for me, which often represented the other for me. But putting them together was quite strange to create these sort of toy-like figures. And the antlers, I was looking at design of antlers from prehistoric animals because I wanted them to have quite big antlers, be quite proud. And something I should say about teddies as well, I always find it quite funny. I mean, you don't really need to know this, but for me, I didn't grow up having a teddy bear. I've always thought a teddy bear as a Western construct. The idea of having toys is all, you know, so I sort of think it's quite funny that I've made these teddies into Indian teddies when having toys like this. You know, I did have toys as a kid. I'm not saying I didn't. It's just I didn't have a teddy bear. It was not a thing, you know, to have teddy bears in Indian culture back then. It is now. I'm just talking about when I was a child growing up. The next show I'm going to talk about is called Interlopers, where all my teddy bears became black in colour. So my forms now are quite solid, they're overstuffed. And the teddies, because they're black in colour and I've given them pointy ears, you're not sure if they're friends or your foe, friends or your enemy, basically. Because I've changed their identity ever so slightly, you're not so sure about their friendliness anymore. So this one, it's quite small. It's quite a small teddy. And I usually place this high up on the gallery wall. So it looks like it's watching you from high up. And because it has one leg cocked down, you sort of think that it might come down and enter the space. So it's in this branch, this copper branch, just sitting high up, watching everything that's going on. Another work in the show was a black curtain. And so the teddies, it goes back to the camouflage work here. So the teddies are sort of hiding in the black curtain. Because when it's in a darkened space, you don't actually see the teddies to begin with. And then you notice them as your eyes get used to the light. And suddenly you see these creatures coming out the curtain. And they seem quite passive, but you're not sure, you know, would they come into the space? Or could you sleep with a curtain like that in your room, you know, with this presence of these teddies along it, which are not just flat, they're three-dimensional forms. And here the teddies now look like they're trying to escape. They're climbing up long copper chains, or they could be climbing into the space. I'm just aware of time, actually. I should. And then this work here, where the teddies, because I make things, like I said myself, I made the teddies in 4 different sizes. So these are the largest ones, which are a meter in height, and the smallest ones are maybe about 30 centimeters. So here they took over the window of the gallery. So they're like guarding the space as well, sort of like looking out and looking in, and they've taken over. So in this show, the black teddies took over the whole space, and each one they're doing different things in different spaces. So these were more mid-sized teddies, which were built into a gap in the wall. And it could be like a cupboard. They're just hiding in the cupboard, or again, they could be climbing to try and, you know, climb out the space. And then another one was high up. And this one is a small teddy, but he's sitting on a bunch of spears, double-sided spears. So again, he's like guarding the space, guarding what's going on. But he's a bit more threatening because he has all the spears. And then there was another two in the space. One was the dark blue one called Classroom. And I was interested in the idea because the first teddy bears, they all had, they were made by Steiff, a company in Germany, and they all had tags in the ear, which I thought was quite strange. So I decided to give this one on the left a copper tag in his ear. And I called it Classroom because he's sitting on a chair. So I thought because this show was in an art school, so it seemed fit to do a work that sort of referenced that. And then another one was, there were a lot of teddies, mid-sized ones sitting in a copper truck. When I showed this work, the big 10 teddies, each venue I show it in, I change the arrangement. So here in New Art Projects, they are now, these are the big ones about a meter high. They seem to have taken over the whole space. And before you enter the space, I've made this steel barrier. So when you enter the space, you're thinking you're entering their space, or there's the other side is a barrier keeping the teddies in the space. So they're all doing different things. You've got three in the middle, look like they're crowding, having a discussion. You've got two guarding the door, going to the next gallery, and then you have one slumped on alone. And you can't see this in the photo, but there's got two at the front as well, that you have to go through two to enter the space and then leave the teddies as you leave the space. It's sort of like making sure you know that it is their space. Okay, this is the last show I'm going to talk about, and called Outgrown, which was in, oh, was it 21? Anyway, there it is. So I've kept a lot of my work still kept along with the theme of the domestic, the home, and making a house. I think this is about the fourth house I made in my work. Normally the house, as you've seen in the past, they have objects in the home, but this one is more barren, it's more empty. It's the bare structure of the house. And because I've welded circular steel rods onto this square steel, it sort of becomes organic and inorganic at the same time. It's both. So it has a feeling that the house could grow. It has all these shoots growing out from the side of it. And the house looks like it's been grown up. And then you have all the offshoots on the floor around. So the idea that other houses could grow, but it also looks like it's been pruned because all the growths are of a similar length. So I sort of feel like you could imagine this house, if you're walking along the woods and then there you come across this house, it's like an abandoned house where only the basic structure, steel structure, exists. In this show, I sort of created, the house was in the middle, and then I wanted to create 4 rooms. So you had the sitting room, a bedroom, a playroom, and a kitchen. So that was the bedroom. I hadn't made a bed for over 20 odd years, 25 years. So it was interesting to go back to making beds. I mean, I haven't showed you, but I made lots and lots of beds in the 90s. So it felt strange going back to making bed, but for this time the bed is different. There's no mattress. It sort of, again, feels like the house abandoned. And underneath are all these bug-like creatures. They're very basic. There's no legs, no arms or claws. I mean, they've got claws on their back, no eyes. There's no features. They're like giant microbes, and they're very colorful, so they're quite inviting. And they've made their home under the bed. And of course, it references those sort of stories of monsters under the bed. But this is not about that, because I would have made a child-sized bed if it was about monsters under the bed. Here, it's about an adult-sized bed, and the owner seems to have gone, and now it's dominated by all these different bugs living underneath. I found it quite strange because I made this work just before the pandemic, and I showed it during the pandemic in London, which was, yeah, it was quite strange because there were like these bug-like creatures and the pandemic happening. It was just a coincidence. And there's a detail of and the claws are quite sharp. So they're definitely not toys. Another work in that room was these tall chairs. This was an older work I made back in '96. So sometimes I bring out older works and show it with newer works. So this one was like the tall beds and the falling figures, but combined. So often I like there to be stories behind the work I make. I imagine stories like, so that you got these two yellow blob-like creatures sitting high up and what could be called thrones, maybe, sort of like a privileged position because they're so high up. And they're curled up into a ball. So they reminded me of Humpty Dumpty. You know, like if one fell, could it get back up on the chair? And because they're curled up, would the other notice that it's fallen off the chair? So the two don't seem to be talking to each other, but because they're yellow, they're sort of like, it's a playfulness about them, but yeah, it's like I can imagine so many different scenarios of stories of what might be happening to them and what's going on with these two quite strange blob-like figures. And then this work is quite small. So this is the kitchen I made in that room. So it's a strange setting. There's like a dialogue going on between the two figures. The one on the left is meant to be a sink, but I don't think it looks like a sink. And then you have these strange antler heads on the wall watching what's going on. So it's quite a strange, surreal setting and environment. But also because it's so small, it feels like quite an intimate setting going on. And so when you play with scale, when you make something small, you feel more vulnerable. They feel more vulnerable, and you want to be protective over them. And so, when you make something big, then you make you as a viewer quite small. And the last work, this is the last work we'll talk about. So the last room was a playroom, where I made these quite small horses or giraffes. They're all like different representations of animals. And something I'm quite interested in, like a lot of my work, I use like snap fasteners or things. So I like the idea that things can change, that things aren't fixed. So with these are like Lego. You can take them apart and reassemble them in lots of different positions. So you could use a head of one and just twist it around, or you could. So it's like nothing is fixed. And how by just simply having a triangle on the back, it becomes like a camel. Or if you have the one on the right, at the beginning, at the bottom, it's contorted. So it doesn't look so, it's like, does it know it's a horse because it's sort of lost its position? So it's something I'm interested in, the idea of that things can change, which leads me on to the show I'm doing this June. I'm doing a show at John Hansard Gallery, which is called Nothing is Fixed. And it's this idea of change and things constantly changing, and that, yeah, basically things never stay the same. So I think I'll end the talk there, if that's okay. I'll stop the share. Hi.
Hi, Permindar. Thank you so much for this great and fascinating talk. We learned a lot about your practice. And now it's time for questions.
Should I stop sharing now the screen?
Yeah. I mean, it's up to you.
Yeah.
So if people want to ask any question, there's now we will start now the Q&A session. So I personally wanted to ask you a couple of things. So one is like you is on the use of contrasting materials, no? The fact that you use terracotta, but also steel, but also fabric and copper. If you could expand a little bit more on that. And also, another thing I wanted to ask you is, every time I think about some of your works, I think about Louise Bourgeois, and I was wondering if her work is like an inspiration for you, or if, I don't know, if you have ever thought about that, I don't know. Then I have another question, but too many, sorry.
I'll answer those two. I mean, Louise Bourgeois, I love her work. I know her work from, I remember seeing it in '93 when she was in the Venice Biennale and she represented America, I think. And from then, that was the first time I came across her work. Yeah, I love her work. I think it's amazing. So yes, she has been a huge influence because the psychology behind her work and all of that, it's something I'm very interested in, I want my people to have an emotional response to my work, which is very, very important. So yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah,
I think a lot of artists love her work, don't they?
I don't know, but I immediately thought about her because of the element of of course, of the house, of the home, and how much disturbing also it could be, no? So of course, the perception, I mean, that the house is such a, like, the topic of the home is such an important, like, a relevant topic, and the fact that I think the disturbing element of it, I think there is like an overlap in your work with her work, and I constantly thought about that watching seeing your work.
I think it's really, it's when I make work, it is quite hard to get the balance right, not to make it too disturbing. I mean, that's the harder bit, actually. Sometimes I can make it too disturbing. It's pulling it back, and so there's a balance, so you don't know, and that is actually quite hard to get right. So the viewer doesn't know which way to think about the work, or to make it too light, and then it's like it has to have that edge, where it's delicately balanced. And then your first question was about my use of materials. I think originally, when I was a student, I pared down to 2 materials because I was thinking more about, trying to bring together the Western and the Indian. That was what I was trying to do, trying to join 2 opposing materials quite seamlessly, or have 2 that you wouldn't normally think could work together. So, but that's sort of gone out the window. But about that, bringing the British English and the Indian together, that's why I did it to begin with. But now it just seems a way, I just like working, trying to bring 2 opposing materials together and seeing how they can join. And I've sort of settled on metal and fabric in the last few years because I still keep finding different ways to work with them.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions. Amanda Doran asks, have you been influenced by Annette Messager, Pikes, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have to have an image of the work, but I do know Messenger's work, and I do like it. Yeah, the early childhood. I mean, there's so many. It's Mike Kelly work I like. Leonore Carrington. I mean, when I was a student, I was looking up her work. I look because I was very much interested in surrealism as a student as well. and Art Pavaro, you know, all of those artists are amazing. The simple use of materials. There's been so many influencers. I think they influenced me a lot more when I was younger, when I was just like a sponge, just taking everything in, before I developed my sort of my own language.
Thank you. There's another question from Kate Morton that also thanks you. So interesting to see your work. Do you draw your ideas?
Yeah, drawing is very, very important, because I could think I want to make a work about this or that, and it just gets stale. Sort of the drawings, it's constantly drawing ideas, not all the time, but when the ideas come, like you draw and then you think, oh, what if I did it this way? And you draw and then you draw, and then you lead you to somewhere where you don't expect. And then normally you can tell in a drawing whether it's a strong idea or not. I can look at a drawing and translate it, because it's like visually reading the drawing and seeing, oh, it could mean this or it could mean that. And it is amazing when a drawing and it's got the whole concept worked out. And so drawing is so and so important, because it allows you to think and develop things without committing to making. Because when you make sculpturally, it takes a lot of time. So you need to commit to something before you start making. But sometimes the drawing only gives half the idea. So sometimes I have to make it and then leave it and work on it to develop it. But drawings are very, very important.
Okay, next question. You have worked with many references, like the beds, by enlarging them, but also with animal figures, monsters, by downsizing them. Is there a specific concern about dimensions in your work? How do you use them? How important is the concept of dimension in your work?
I think dimensions was more important in the past, because when I made something, I would only make it one size, and then that's it. If it was going to be big, it had to be big. If it was small. But when I made the black teddies, that changed things, because I made them in 4 different sizes. And then I realized that large house I've made a smaller version of it. So I'm more confused about how I use dimensions now, weirdly, because I suddenly realized I don't have to make one and that's it. It can be another one, which would be a different word, but it's smaller, but it has it means different things. So yeah, I remember reading this amazing book called On Longing, where the author, but she talked about about the grotesque, the miniature, the gigantic, and all those things. Stewart, and that was quite interesting to read that and the theory about what it means to use different sizes and to do different with work. But I sort of did it without meaning to to begin with. When I started out working, it wasn't planned. It's just something that I did. But I also realized, like, say with the tall beds and the teddies, it could be something simple, but just say with a wedge, just elongating the legs, the whole work changed. You don't have to drastically alter something for it suddenly to have a completely different meaning.
Thank you. Maybe one last question for me, from me, sorry, is that you were talking a little bit about those 10 years of break. And when you showed the images of the works, it seemed like after those 10 years, the sculptures, the teddy bears, those kind of characters became more solid. Also with clones, yeah, clothes, yeah. So I was wondering what happened in those 10 years, and if you think that there was like like a shift, a change in your work in that kind of direction, like maybe more like they seem to be fighters almost. I don't know.
I mean, even though like with the black teddies, I made them solid, they still felt like shadows though. They had the solidity, but they also were not there, especially the larger ones. So they're still playing with the idea, are they there or not? I'm still questioning what it means to have made them solid though. I'm trying to figure that out, the change in it. Does it are they more real now? They're sort of more of the real world. Because the teddies do feel like more like real teddies, you know. Maybe they're too close to real teddies. Well, when I flattened them, they were in the, because I like for it to be not too close to real life in some ways. So yeah, it's always dialogue.
So it seems they seem to be really more. I don't want to use the word aggressive because it's not the right word, but the fact that they have clothes, they are really I don't know, more ready to you know um, to cope or to deal with life, with the environment in another way. I don't know. I don't know. That was my perception of them. But
I think with the Indian teddies, I did something I don't normally do. I gave them a structure inside. Because those teddies wouldn't support the weight of those copper antlers. The teddies could not support that. They would just be, you know, copper's quite heavy. And I think that created for me a strange element because I'm sort of like to work with two materials. That if the material does that, it has to react in that way. But in there, I did do an internal steel framework to support the weight of that. They do have this, they're more proud, you know, with their giant antlers, and you think you should be a bit more wary of them. And they're very glitzy because of fabric and the copper. And so they have, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question actually. That why are they have seem to have more power than they did in the past.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, which is good. It's positive.
Yeah, from my perception of them. Last question from Silvia Calderoni. I have another question. In your work, there are often figures that recall the world of childhood, but at the same time, they carry elements that can hurt and make them a bit of little monsters. Could you say something more about this?
I think the work often looks like childhood because they're not real objects. So I'm making like very basic, like with the horses, I'm making very basic like child's drawings of them. And people often think the work is about my childhood. But I have done some work, but not very many actually, about my childhood. So it's just, I think it's just a way of communicating different feelings. So, and when you make sculpture, it just seems easier to do quite simple forms. So they sort of look like childhood objects, or they're not from the real world. And I think when they have that sense of innocence around them, that childhood, it sort of opens up the viewer to looking at the work in a different, it opens them up to be in their own childhood realm in some ways, so they can see different ideas behind the work. That if I had done something which was not, you know, more of the real world, maybe they would find the work more threatening, I don't know, or more disturbing. I want there to be this sort of playful, disturbing element. And so using childhood symbol helps me do that.
clear. Thank you, Permindar, and thank you so much for being with us tonight, for accepting my invite and for sharing your work with us. Thank you also to all the people that joined us tonight and asked questions. I just want to remind people that this talk it has been recorded, so it will be published online on our YouTube channel in a few days. So Permindar, thank you again very much for being with us, and have a great evening, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Permindar.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.